in 1775, a corner of the burying ground was utilized for a schoolhouse. By that time, this part of Germantown was getting busier and more kids who had to walk all the way down to Schoolhouse Lane for the academy there. And so this was set up as many such small schools were. As a community effort, families paid a small fee to pay for the upkeep and a teacher. Sometimes they were expected to bring a certain amount of coal or wood in the winter to heat the place. There was always a challenge of finding a good teacher. They were usually men at first, and somebody who wanted to really take on the job seriously and stay, but they often turned over. They weren't paid very well. And it was one story at first, and the second story was added in 1818. And we think there was a period when it was very busy, and the boys were on the first floor and the girls were on the second floor, which no doubt reduced some of the commotion that otherwise would occur with kids of all ages trying to learn together. They did learn, even though it seems like a pretty primitive way of doing things. This schoolhouse served as a community school until Philadelphia set up its public school system. Now that didn't happen until 1854, at least here, because that was when the various townships around Philadelphia, Germantown, Frankfort, Roxborough, and so forth, all became part of Philadelphia when the area was consolidated under one municipal government. And so once there was a public school system, these kinds of community-supported schools weren't needed, but it was then rented sequentially by a variety of individuals who conducted it as what they called then a select school, which means something like a private school. And obviously it couldn't be a huge number of students, and that went on for quite a bit of time. There were other uses as well. The second floor, I think in the late 19th, early 20th century, became the home of a gentleman's library. There's some photographs on the wall inside which show you what that looks like, and some of the chairs that were there we had downstairs. I don't know if they did a lot of reading or just drank sherry and talked politics or whatever they might have done. Then it could be rented out for various uses over time and continuously looked after by a nonprofit board. Some years were, I'm sure, more attentive in looking after the place than others, but it was well built. It was built by Jacob Noor, and you'll see a lot of markers here for the Noor family, K-N-O-R-R. They were master builders, or Jacob was, and I think his son, and they were patriots as well. They fought on the American side, and they also built Cliveden, which is a much more elaborate structure, obviously. A neighboring building, although not the one that's there now, Kirk and Nice Funeral Home, it's now a church, was an outgrowth of the Noor family, which as carpenters also built caskets, coffins, and then they became funeral managers, and but also skilled builders before there were really trained architects, at least in our area. It was created as a burying ground in 1693 when Germantown and Philadelphia were both relatively new communities. And it was a community effort. It's not like most small burying grounds. It's not associated with any particular church or denomination. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but this was people coming together, both German-speaking and English-speaking. And if you look at the stone markers, you'll see that some are Germanic names, some are in German or some variant of it, and many are in English. The individuals buried here are Germantowners, usually of very modest means. If you've been ever to Laurel Hill Cemetery or Woodland Cemetery, you'll see massive, elaborate, wonderful monuments. These were much plainer people, not necessarily Quakers, probably some of them were, I'm not sure about that, but Mennonites. And the burying ground early on was open to whoever needed it. There were records, we have records of the early years, and some would indicate burial of a stranger, somebody who came to Philadelphia for whatever reason, had the misfortune to die here. Mr. Smith's Negro is recorded. The Negro boy, was that a slave? We really don't know. In 1763, whoever was in charge kind of was narrowing their viewpoint on the world, and mulattoes and Negroes, as then called, were no longer permitted to be buried here. And by then, many of our members had grown their own churches and so had churchyards. But the poor were assigned to the Germantown Potter's Field, which is down in not far from where I live, along Queen Lane and Pulaski Street area. We think there's about 1,500 burials here. Not all have markers. Some may have just disappeared. Some may be underground that we'll dig up someday. Some just probably couldn't afford a marker. Some families couldn't afford that. The earliest marker is over here, and this is Cornelius Tyson. The name later was changed to Tyson, Tyson, and became a very large family known in Philadelphia. There's a Tyson Street. There's a very famous physician named James Tyson in the 19th century. And the date of death is 1716, so that's the earliest that we know of. And a couple of years ago, some descendants wanted to do something to commemorate this individual. It was one of the founding, remember, one of the 13 founding families of Germantown, who came from a particular area in what we now consider Germany, but was, I guess, on the border with the Netherlands, and to translate the engraving and make it more readable. And we had to find a scholar at the University of Pennsylvania who could read the text. I don't mean make it out, that was a problem in itself, but translate it, because it isn't modern German and it isn't modern Dutch. It's some dialect or hybrid of those, and we were able to get a pretty good translation. And we have buried here as well, the flags indicate veterans, 50 or so veterans of the American Revolution, some from the Civil War, and so forth. And the last burial we know of was 1916, so it was somewhat abandoned until a couple of 15 or 20 years ago, not entirely so, but the current board, which is really the people who look after it and pick up the weeds and put on programs, open it up on certain days. And we've been working bit by bit to get it in better shape.